As y'all have heard me say before, the most important part of planning any adventure are the snacks. And if you're looking for a delicious and nutritious snack that packs a real protein punch, crack into a good source of protein with tasty, healthy, wonderful pistachios. Each 1 ounce serving of wonderful pistachios contains 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value in that one serving. It's one of the highest protein nuts out there. And that's not all. Pistachios are also known for the fiber and better for you unsaturated fats, which may help keep you feeling fuller longer. Best part, wonderful pistachios come in a variety of flavors and sizes. Perfect for enjoying with your family and friends or taking them with you on your summer adventures for those snacks we're talking about. So whether you're dropping off the kiddos or running between meetings or about to climb a mountain, fuel up with a healthy and tasty snack. Wonderful Pistachios will be your new go-to. You can check them out at wonderfulpistachios.com and learn more about how these little green wonders can power up your day. Hey folks, I missed last Thursday. You probably noticed that we didn't have an episode. Friday came around and I'm like, I got to get something up. But I was not able to get to the podcast last Thursday. And here's why. I was traveling for work. Oftentimes I do the podcast, a day or two before publishing date. I should plan ahead, but story of my life, not planning ahead far enough in advance. And it caught me. I was so busy with my day job. And then right after that, I had a conference to go speak at in Florida where I live. It was a conservation conference all about the progress of this idea called the Florida Wildlife Corridor, something I'm hugely passionate about, protecting the wild lands of Florida, my home state. And between getting ready for that talk, doing my actual job, and then also 3, launching a new podcast, I was not able to upload a show on Thursday. And let me tell you about my new show real quick. It's called Florida Uncut, and it's all about talking to the people who are dedicating their lives to making sure Florida stays connected and protected. There's this really cool and innovative idea in Florida, like I just mentioned, called the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And what's so neat about it, it's not just protect land and keep it from, turning into houses or parking lots or more roads, keeping it an intact ecosystem, but it's also making sure it can connect to other green spaces. So like, for instance, Yosemite, which is what we're going to talk about in today's episode, what good is it if it's just surrounded by development all the way around? It's basically a zoo without fences. It's better if land can connect to other pieces of land so that those animals, those birds and plants, even those ecosystems can be connected for transportation and migration, and allows more fluidity in nature. So there's a lot of really big ideas for corridors out there, like the Yukon to Yellowstone or Yellowstone to Yukon corridor. There's others that are basically saying, hey, let's not just protect land, but let's make sure all these protected lands have essentially pathways between them, green spaces that connect them so that those animals can migrate and, create more genetic diversity within them. Because that's one thing that leads to the downfall of a species, an endangered species especially, is when they're confined to a really small area. There's just a lot of genetic inbreeding that goes on until eventually the entire population collapses. That's what happened to the mammoth, woolly mammoth on, I think, Wrangel Island. That's what they think happened, is just, they're stuck on an island. Anyway, I'm getting way in the weeds here. That was what my podcast is about, interviewing the people behind the idea to protect wild Florida and just hearing their stories. There's not a podcast dedicated to it. I wanted to start one. This is what I spend a lot of my free time doing. Like I've told y'all, my love for adventure has evolved over the years to wanting to understand how the land and how the places that we have adventures come to be. I've had life-changing experiences in places like Yosemite, which we're going to talk about today. But how did Yosemite National Park come to be? Who are the people that make these places protected and the places they become for all of us to enjoy? How does it happen? And what I've learned is it doesn't just happen. There's a lot of dedicated people spending a lot of time, money, and energy to make sure these gems of nature, these crown jewels, stay intact and stay open for recreation and stay places that we can go and be inspired. And so I have been deeply, deeply inspired by the place Yosemite National Park, probably more than any place else in the world. And today we're talking to David Smart, who recently authored a book on one of the people that helped to push that idea through adventure sports, through the sport specifically of climbing and also whitewater kayaking, Royal Robbins. You may have heard that name before, not really known what that means. It's kind of a unique name, but it's definitely sticks out a little bit. Well, Royal is a climber from the same era that Yvon Chouinard and Doug Tompkins, the founders of both Patagonia and the North Face, around the time they were in Yosemite Valley climbing, the birth of the sport of big wall climbing and sport climbing. Well, Royal's right up there with them, and he's doing it in a unique way, and he's kind of on the forefront of that mindset of low impact climbing, like climbing without using tons of tools, tons of gear that you have to basically anchor into the rock, drill into the rock to put anchors up. Royal's like, no, do it in a way that there's no, basically leave no trace climbing. He was forward thinker in that sense. So we're going to talk to David about this person that he never met, but he was in the same circles as them. I thought this was a really interesting story. And you can find the book, Royal Robbins, The American Climber, at mountaineers.org. So sorry for the super long intro, but I wanted to explain what was going on last week. This Thursday, I'm going to tease my new podcast. I'm going to share a little bit of the first episode. And if you like it, go check it out. It is very different than this show, but it's all connected. You know, at some point, if you love adventure, a lot of times you're having adventures on public places like a national park or a state park or something that's not an urban setting. Find out how that place came to be. And if you want others to have the same opportunity you have to have adventures in these places, see how you can get involved. That's what I'm doing these days. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. Hey folks, welcome to the Adventure Sports Podcast. You heard a little about David and about Royal Robbins in the intro. But we're here with David Smart to learn about the process to writing this book, the backstory, the life, the legend. Thank you so much for joining us. How you doing, David?
Very well. Thanks for inviting me, Mason.
Yeah, as is tradition, I always ask, where are you coming from? If that's home for you, great. If not, where's home for you?
I'm in Toronto, in Canada, right now. Yeah.
You know, you never know with this show. People are on the other side of the world half the time. So
yeah,
having someone in my own time zone is kind of rare, actually.
Yeah.
So how did you, where's the interest in, because this isn't your first foray into kind of writing a biography for a famous climber. Is Toronto known for climbing? Is that where you grew up? Is that where you got interested in this? Tell us the backstory there.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I've been a climber since 1976. And I've seen a lot of the evolution of climbing, obviously. And there is a substantial climbing community here in Toronto, in Ontario. We climb on small cliffs, but we're close to the Gunks as well, which is a major center of world rock climbing, American rock climbing in particular, and was a center of American rock climbing before Yosemite was. And so I've always been rock climber. I climbed not all over the world, but all over Europe and other places in the world, and North America, absolutely. And so when I started climbing in the 70s, going to Yosemite and climbing El Capitan or Half Dome or these enormous routes that had been put up in the 1950s by, Roy Robbins and his friends and, Warren Harding and his friends. was a major objective. And the guys I started climbing with, that was this sort of the center of their existence, was getting through the work year to get enough money to go to Yosemite and climb these enormous routes. So they've always been part of my, landscape of dreams and aspirations, spending days on end climbing up one of these rock walls. And I did do that. I have climbed El Capitan and Half Dome and quite a few other routes in Yosemite. And there was always this lore in the background of, like what was presently cool in climbing was, having long hair and, wearing a headband and, athletic free climbing and all this stuff. And you look at these pictures that seem just incredibly ancient of the guys like Royal Robbins in crew cuts and sunglasses with these gigantic arrays of heavy pitons hanging from their shoulders, pounding their way up these walls. And it seemed like at the time, both a little dated and sort of awe-inspiring that someone would walk up to a totally unclimbed cliff like El Capitan, which is some, I guess, 3,600 feet high. And just with everyone else in the world saying it's impossible to climb it, spend days nailing their way up there. And over time, I became more and more interested in the history of climbing, how climbing developed. And there's quite a lot of literature about how mountaineering happened, expedition stories about Mount Everest and so on. But stories just about climbing and the great climbers of history were often quite murky. So I wrote in 2018, and before that I'd written some novels, historical novels about climbing. And fiction's really just, it's another way of looking at history, really. In any case, professional historians are always accusing each other of writing fiction. But then I became interested in writing more just the straight up stories, because some of the stories, like, you realize there's nothing you could add to this to make it more incredible. Stories in climbing. So I wrote a book about Paul Preuss, an Austrian free soloist who was very much in his own time seen in the same light as Alex Honnold is now, and doing things that people thought were impossible, but doing them on site, free solo, just walking up to it without a rope. Everyone thinks it's impossible, and then climbing it. And I published that in 2018. And Preuss was also in that line in which you could put Royal Robbins, which is, he was very much a believer in climbing as something where there should be rules or ethics, or at least clarity about who's doing what, how, and that there should be minimum use of technology. Mostly it should just be your hands and feet and whatever fortitude you can muster to take on whatever your objective is before you. And then I wrote a book that came out in 2020 on the Italian climber Emilio Comici, who invented big wall climbing. And he was famous for saying his line would go where one drop of water fell from the top of the wall, that he would just climb straight up and overcome any difficulties he found as he climbed upwards. And he was a more complicated figure than Preuss, because he embraced technology, although he also very much admired Paul Preuss, and he did a lot of free soloing, but he was known for inventing big wall climbing, like spending several days on a really hard route, using a lot of pitons if necessary. And then that book did well. It won the Boardman Tasker Award in Britain, and the attention it got probably contributed to my getting the H. Adams Carter Award for mountain literature from the American Alpine Club. And my connections personally in climbing were, although I climbed a fair amount in Europe, were to that North American scene. And so I started looking for a subject that would be like the next step from Komichi, like where the center of climbing somehow, the world center of climbing shifts from the Alps to America after the Second World War in the 1950s. And sort of who was most behind that change in how people saw climbing, and where people who climbed wanted to go to learn to be climbers. And that, when you boiled it all down, it was Royal, for sure. He was behind that. He pushed it harder than anyone else. People contributed who did things with him. People contributed who did things to piss him off. But he was the driver.
Before this, did you feel, kind of with climbing history, Royal was, despite being so influential and being known, did you feel he was even at that point underrated or correctly rated? How did you, from being a climber yourself growing up in that time, do you feel like, I don't know if he's the first names that comes off the tongue when you think of him, but he's up there. But like, as far as just in culture, what was your feeling about that?
Well, I mean, he was not involved in Himalayan climbing during a great age of Himalayan first ascents. He was climbing during, he was in a car driving to Yosemite for the weekend the night that they announced that Mount Everest had been climbed for the first time. And, that was kind of really outside of their purview, because as Tom Hornbein, an American early American Himalayan climber, told me, Royal, like, he had enough to climb in Yosemite, and he wasn't ultimately necessarily really engaged with the idea of like going on a big expedition and becoming famous, because Yosemite was like, even the American Alpine Journal didn't report on it in the 1950s. They gave like 2 paragraphs on the first ascent of the Salathe Wall, like probably the most important climb ever done in America at that time, and maybe after that time too. So the Yosemite scene was kind of a little bit on the fringe.
Did he feel pressure to be a mountaineer, or was he totally content with where he was?
No, he tried to. He. It's a good question, because he did go to the Alps and try to and succeed in doing like the hardest big wall rock routes that they had in Chamonix at the time, adding 2 of his own. But he was never really comfortable climbing on snow and ice. He could on occasion just surprise everyone and like on-site free solo a big north wall in the Canadian Rockies. But by and large, people said, like, he was very tentative on these kinds of things that are relatively simple for alpinists, like long, easy snow slopes, or, moderate scrambling on loose rock. Like if the rock was in any way solid, he was, by far one of the best climbers of his era. But he would be very tentative on that kind of stuff. I think it just mainly kind of didn't interest him. He was mostly interested in rock climbing, or climbing on rock or climbing on mountain routes, which were mainly rock. So I think he really fought for the legitimacy of Yosemite at a time when the kinds of, super sustained long routes he was interested in doing were not being done by a lot of people. A lot of people just didn't have the skills, partly because Royal and his friends were like an avant-garde who were inventing and using them.
Such a wild time. It's just so many hugely influential people all in one place, influential to this day. And I felt like a lot of them felt the need to start like a clothing brand too, or just did.
Yeah.
Why was that such a common theme with so many of these, the Mount Rushmore of climbing history? Why did all of them start a brand around clothing?
Well, I think in the case of Yvon Chouinard, who was behind the Patagonia brand, and in the case of Royal, he was, they started out with hardware brands, right? Like Royal he started out importing hardware from Europe that you couldn't get in North America and selling that, both, at first just wholesale, but then retail as well. And then he started developing his own branded stuff, particularly carabiners. But there were lawsuits and fear of being sued over climbing hardware, failing or being misused or these things. And the same thing happened with Chouinard equipment. Chouinard had started with the Great Pacific Iron Works, and then they faced lawsuits about people who really had misused climbing equipment or weren't really experienced enough, or their expectations were kind of not in sync with what you might reasonably expect from equipment. And then to protect themselves, they diversified. They went into clothing. Royal Robbins, of course, the Royal Robbins brand is still around. Patagonia brand is still very much around. And in the case of Chouinard, he's the Chouinard Climbing Equipment Company kind of morphed into the modern Black Diamond equipment company. And I think that's really was it, to protect themselves, because it wasn't a big market for hardware. It was hard to design, expensive to procure or to make. Just being in soft goods was a lot safer.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me about Royal Robbins is how, maybe this is just the pictures that exist. There isn't tons and tons, but he looks so modern. He's got a crew cut. He's wearing glasses. I mean, he looks like my dad, but like modern. Like I'm like, whoa, this guy looks like he's walking down the street. I don't know. There's something about him doesn't look the same era as like Yvon Chouinard or a Doug Tompkins or some of the early dirtbags. What was that indicative of anything?
Well, I think he was had a natural sort of style in a way that he didn't really even realize, like that he could choose clothes that looked good on him. He was tall, so clothes did look good on him. He was a very strong, fit guy. He was a leader, and I think he was on the thing with starting the clothes to sell some of his style was really Liz, his wife, I think, to a great degree, saying, we should sell the style, the look that we've sort of accidentally put together here in our little community in Yosemite. And yeah, he does when you see it now. I mean, from the point of view of some eras, like in the 1970s, when I was a teenager climbing, guys with crew cuts and the glasses he wore and so on, they look kind of, in button-up shirts, they looked really kind of old-fashioned and dated, but now everything's come around and they look pretty cool. I agree.
Let's take a quick message break and hear from the folks that help make this show possible. This episode is brought to us by Oris Watches. You know, a piece of equipment on any adventure that I'm honestly surprised by how much I use is my watch. And I'm wearing a watch right now. I always have a watch on. And I believe that you should check out Oris Watches. Oris is a 119-year-old family-owned independent watch brand based out of Holstein, Switzerland. The brand has been certified climate and carbon neutral since 2021, and every year releases a sustainability report. Oris only makes mechanical watches like the new Pro Pilot X Caliber 400 and the new Pro Pilot Altimeter featuring a 3D printed carbon case. If you're a fan of mechanical watches like I am, there's nothing in the game that's better than Oris, and you can discover the full Oris collection at a retailer near you or at oris.ch. So if you want that one piece of equipment in your life to be functional, to be useful, to be beautiful, artistic, check out Oris watches. Oris, go your own way. This episode is brought to us by Oris watches. You know what piece of equipment on any adventure that I'm honestly surprised by how much I use is my watch. And I'm wearing a watch right now. I always have a watch on. And I believe that you should check out Oris watches. Oris is a 119-year-old family-owned independent watch brand based out of Hallstein, Switzerland. The brand has been certified climate and carbon neutral since 2021, and every year releases a sustainability report. Oris only makes mechanical watches like the new Pro Pilot X Caliber 400 and the new Pro Pilot Altimeter featuring a 3D printed carbon case. If you're a fan of mechanical watches like I am, there's nothing in the game that's better than Oris, and you can discover the full Oris collection at a retailer near you or at oris.ch. So if you want that one piece of equipment in your life to be functional, to be useful, to be beautiful, artistic, check out Oris watches. Oris, go your own way. That is plenty of that for now. Let's get back into the episode. That's funny. Well, I just commented, I'm like, man, he looks like he could just walk right out of this book and be ready to go.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you know about something else that's modern about him? I feel like is his commitment to conservation and commitment to clean climbing, or at least having as minimal impact on the land as possible. Where did you learn that came from? That kind of obsession with being, was it just to do what the climbers are doing, but more difficult without all this, added equipment, bolts and pitons, or was it more from that conservation mindset of like, we've got to take care of this?
I don't think you can really separate them. I think it was a matter of respect for a lot of things. And one of the things that Royal really respected was British climbing. He went to Britain. He loved it in the UK, and the people there loved him too. And he started a sort of British invasion of Yosemite by giving talks there. And in Great Britain, when he went there in the early 60s, clean climbing was really a thing. Like, it had always been a thing. There were outcrops, like gritstone outcrops, where there were 0 pitons, and there still are 0 pitons. And he was attracted to the idea that with work and commitment and a few of the right simple tools, you could just sort of eliminate all this impact that pitons were having on American cliffs. And, you could see the scars still in lots of places in Yosemite and the Gunks, elsewhere, from pitons being put in and out. And he was attracted to that idea of doing more with less, and maybe not being able to go as many places, but being able to, use these new skills, even if they made the climbing a little bit more scary or a little bit more complicated. He was responding to the fact that pitons were obviously having a great impact, but not everyone he was really a visionary in this regard as well, because he showed the nuts and things that he was going to use for clean climbing to people like Chouinard, who at first thought he was crazy. They said it looked like, old junk that he found beside the railway tracks. And some of it actually was, but so I think it was that. It was both, because style was a thing. And I think this gets to all kinds of things about Royal's life: how he appeared, how he lived, how he came across to other people, how he climbed, really how he dressed, even, like how that there was, he didn't really care if people disagreed with him, if people thought he was wrong about things. He didn't mind that, but he always was very conscious of trying to stick to the highest possible standard he knew of for what he was doing. And once he knew that clean climbing existed, there was sort of no chance of Royal not saying this is the way forward, and I'm trying to get people to do it.
Where do you think that commitment to high standards came from? Was he raised that way? Was it the military, natural? Did he have a family like that?
He said that that he was influenced that way. In a couple of letters, he said that he was influenced that way by the military, but he already was very much that way already before he was ever in the army. And I think that, I think he had a very hard youth, and both of the father figures in his life, his biological father and his stepfather, were alcoholics. His stepfather was violent towards him, and he saw a lot of irresponsible adult behavior as a boy, and he craved sort of direction. And then when he joined the Boy Scouts, he got that. The Boy Scouts were an enormous influence on his life. He had had trouble. He'd been arrested for burglary, did a lot of pretty dangerous things as a boy. And then when he joined the Boy Scouts, there was a spirit of being able to make yourself into something if you stuck to the philosophies and their approaches, and that was really liberating for him, to be around adults with good ideas about how to channel his energy, and he felt that was the rewarding way to go, to stick to principles. You got the most out of doing things. And then also I do think he was trying to make up for, like he knew that, living a kind of, disordered life led to misery, not only for the individuals, like his stepfather, who, as I said, was an alcoholic and was very violent towards both Royal and his mother. And also his father was not present at all, his biological father, and was a sort of a fantasist who, he occasionally wrote letters, he made up, but not often, and he made up a lot of stories exaggerating his achievements. Not that his father had no achievements. He'd actually been a welterweight champion in boxing in West Virginia, but he made up all kinds of stories about himself. And Royal found that disturbing as a boy, right? Because he could tell that these stories were untrue. And he himself kind of became somebody who was like, that's not the way to develop as a person. That way, I'm going to be centered on my principles and beliefs. Not that Royal was a stick in the mud, actually. Like there are lots of stories about him and his friends, partying, having fun. He had a sense of humor and so on. It was really fun to be one of these guys doing all these routes back at the time. They all made that point. But I think that was he was one of these climbers, like Henry Barber after him, Reinhold Messner. These guys they have reasons often rooted in their childhood, but somehow mysteriously in their personalities generally, that there are right ways and wrong ways to do things, and whatever other people are going to do, they're going to do it what they see as the right way. And certainly Royal did want to conserve climbing areas, absolutely, and he wanted to conserve Yosemite, and he was prescient that way too, because the Park Service was already concerned about scarring and had from pitons, and had closed down a couple of areas close to nature trails where you could see the piton scarring. So without clean climbing, it's hard to know where exactly Yosemite climbing would have been in the end, right?
The Via Ferrata routes everywhere you look, maybe, like a lot of the
Well,
Alps.
the parks would not have allowed it, right? Like that's the thing, right? Like I climb a lot in the Canadian Rockies where the rock is very loose and alternatives for protection are pretty limited. So it was pitons before, it's bolts now. There isn't that much other protection. In Yosemite, the rock is brilliant, and it's in a highly traveled park. And so the only other option was something like making less of an impact. And Royal was definitely, he led the way with that.
What do you know about his first experience in Yosemite? Was it immediately a monumental shift in his life? Was it, built over time, kind of this growing appreciation for the place? Because it is a mecca for a lot of people, for myself included. It was something I anticipated seeing for years, and once I did, I mean, it's heaven on earth. So
it doesn't disappoint.
No, it doesn't. There's no way to hype it beyond what people are going to experience when they're there. What do you know about his first times seeing the valley?
Well, it's an answer, like it's has to be answered in sort of referring to like three different occasions. First occasion, he goes with his Scoutmaster Bailey, who was a beat cop from LA who Royal really, really respected. And they went there and a couple other scouts with him to do kind of a reconnaissance for a scout camping trip. And he went there and he looked up at El Cap. Scoutmaster Bailey said to him, "No one will ever climb that. It's just impossible." But Royal didn't rock climb at the time. That was about a year or two before he started rock climbing with the scouts. And it's so he doesn't record his reaction, but the fact that he's recorded this at all is obviously he thought it was kind of funny in retrospect. Then he returned after he learned some climbing in the Sierras with a friend, and they ended up climbing nothing. Like he came into Yosemite, he didn't know, he had minimum equipment and experience, and he just thought, well, I'll start climbing on some of these walls. And that was a bust. But his first serious trip as a climber, he made his mark immediately. He climbed the Arrowhead Buttress, enormous unrepeated route, done over like several days. He did it in 2 days. Everyone was just like blown away. He walked up to Alan Steck, and this like, echoed through the halls of climbing history. And Steck was like the dean of Yosemite climbing. He'd been to the Alps. He'd climbed hard, like Komichi's routes on in the Dolomites and Big North Faces, and he had done this Steck Salate, which was this enormous climb in the biggest, hardest rock climb in North America, basically up the Sentinel. And Royal walked up to him and said, "So have you got anything worthwhile to climb around here?" And Steck was kind of like, "Who the hell is this?" Right. And so Royal kind of made his real climbing entree there, thinking, I'm just gonna take this place by storm. And then he did the Steck Salate in record time. Totally, like everyone thought him and his friends from Tahquitz Rock in Southern California weren't gonna make any kind of mark, that they didn't have that kind of polish that all the university guys like Steck and his friends, guys who'd been to Europe. I mean, some of them had been to Europe during the war, but there was a more academic kind of scene in San Francisco, and these punk kids from Southern California were not expected to add up to much. And immediately Royal was like beating all the times on the hardest climbs that were there. he saw it, I think, right away as a place where he was going to be able to make his mark. He didn't have much money, he didn't have much education. He dropped out of high school, and he later went back, completed it in high school and in night school, and took a bunch of other courses. And he was really like a self-taught intellectual and really one of our great philosophers in climbing. But at the time, I think he really craved some place where he could make his mark. And all he had to do to do it in Yosemite was to get up there in some crappy car from Los Angeles. The world was his oyster, like, Half Dome, El Capitan, almost all the other walls were not climbed by any meaningful routes.
He's been called the conscience of rock climbers. How did he earn that title, and what does that mean?
Well, I think he earned it partly by the clean climbing thing. He also was always trying to improve on style. When Warren Harding climbed El Capitan via the nose, he used hundreds of bolts and many, many days, and he supplied camps, and scores of fixed ropes went up and down. And Royal felt like things should be done in a better way, right? He felt like doing things any way that you possibly could was not good enough, that you ought to hold yourself to a standard and allow the better climber to do something, like just not bringing down the challenge to your own level. And so there was that, and like he was against the excessive use of bolts. He felt like bolts and drilling should be kept to a minimum because, Yosemite was obviously a limited resource. It looks pretty majestic, but it's only 5 miles long, right? And that putting up a route like just with an endless number of bolts up El Capitan was not desirable. Of course, he's famously known for removing part of a route on El Capitan, the Dawn Wall. A complicated story, to be sure, but he was doing it because he believed, or he started doing it because he believed that it was a bad omen for the future that a route that was mainly bolts should go up on El Cap. He stopped partway because he realized that actually the route was pretty awesome.
That he had already cut all those bolts.
Yeah, he cut a lot of the bolts. It was a very complicated and strange affair. He also felt pressured to act, right? Like he was the guy who should act, right? And people did say, Royal, are you going to do anything about all those bolts on the Dawn Wall? I mean, people who could have just done it themselves, but they wanted Royal to be the guy. And then I think also with the clean climbing, right? And it gets down to an issue of what would you do as a climber, how are you going to behave when no one is looking, right? In a way, they were inventing American climbing in Yosemite, and what was that going to be like? Was it going to be something where you just sort of did whatever you wanted and you used any number of bolts and so on, or was it going to be something where you integrated, natural crack lines and moved up those as much as you could and waited until you were bold enough to do it with a minimum of bolts? That was Royal.
Going into this, you probably had a decent amount of knowledge on him just being around the scene early on. Did you know him?
No, I never met him, but I could have met him. I was climbing and he was around, and I was even in the industry when he was still alive, but I never did meet him. I've subsequently met many of his friends and family members, but not. I never met Royal, unfortunately. He sounds like a very impressive person to be around, like that he made a big impression on people who actually met him.
What did you find going into this, knowing what you did know about him, having not met him, but knowing about him and his impact on the sport. What's something that really surprised you about him through your research that you just didn't know beforehand? Maybe it was a misconception about him, or maybe it was just a side of him people didn't get to see.
I think there are a few things. One is that Royal was surprisingly, like, in some ways, a physically fragile person, right? Like that he could undergo all kinds of hardships and depredations on a climb. But if he was actually like physically injured, like with any kind of like rock fall or anything that, you know, really caused him a serious injury, he could be fragile, which was it was sort of touching. Like it was kind of like Achilles's heel or something like that, and almost hard to sort of imagine. But people were surprised by that too when it happened. There was a kind of
just like not handling it with the grit you would imagine him to, just kind of really tending to the wounds.
Really like being kind of broken down by it, like hurt by like if, you know, there were occasions where there was rock fall or something like that, and he would kind of become like faint and need people's help and so on. And not like ever like sort of losing his cool about it, but just kind of suddenly, you know, fading under that blow. And that was, it only happened a few times in his life, but I was really kind of moved by that this sort of like almost like Superman type character could have this sort of frail side to him.
And he also dealt with arthritis, which I think hindered him tremendously with climbing.
Yeah, well, he was very stoic about that, right? And about, you know, his illness towards the end of his life. But if it kind of things that would suddenly, like, you know, like a rock falling on him, causing, you know, bleeding or incapacitating him somehow, this sort of very human fragility could come out. There was that. His relationship with Warren Harding was much more complicated than the urban myths of climbing, is that they like kind of were lifelong enemies, but they were actually lifelong friends. I mean, Royal could be very hurt by some of the things Warren did, and vice versa, I'm sure. But they, you know, Royal went to see Warren Harding before Warren died, and there was a closeness there, a friendship there that outlasted even Royal chopping all those bolts on Warren's route, the Dawn Wall. And certainly the notion that they kind of both left climbing afterwards and didn't talk to each other ever again is absolute nonsense. They both kept climbing, and after that, and, you know, Warren came and stayed at Royal's house in Modesto. So not that there weren't tensions and disagreements between them, but there were certainly that. Yeah, Royal's dedication to his family, also his Appalachian upbringing, like just how much, like the absolute serious poverty in which he grew up, that surprised me for certain. Like I knew a little bit about it, but the depth of it and the impact on him, I hadn't really known.
Let's take a quick message break and hear from the folks that help make this show possible.
The best travel gear isn't born in a factory. It's inspired by journeys taken by real people exploring the world. That's why I love Rourke. Their team pulls designs and inspiration straight from the places they travel and have adventures. And for over 10 years, they've been exploring the globe to seek adventures on the road less traveled. Everything from surfing waves on remote island chains to exploring the streets of Jakarta, the Scottish Highlands, and almost everything in between. Rourke has developed options for you. I'm actually wearing the Rourke Bless Up breathable stretch shirt right now, and I was wearing a Rourke shirt yesterday. I'm traveling right now, and you could probably hear the echo in the room, but I was at this event. This guy was speaking, and he looked down at me, pointed at me right in the middle of his talk and said, "Nice shirt." And I was like, "Thank you very much." It was a Rourke shirt. And I've got my Accomplice Mule 45-liter bag. I love it because it can hold all my podcast gear, take it on the plane, but also holds extra stuff. I can put some clothes in there too. And if I didn't have my podcast gear, it could probably hold everything I needed for this trip. And it's water resistant. I love that. So Rourke offers durable, comfortable styles inspired by the places they've been. And they've got their latest collection, the Hokkaido, featuring Japanese prints and patterns and Japanese manufactured Kaihara premium denim. So if you're traveling, Rourke has the gear options. And for a limited time, if you're a listener of the show, you can get 15% off your first order. Go to Rourke.com. Use the code ASP15 at checkout. That's ROARK.com and use the code ASP15 for 15% off your first order.
I cannot tell you how excited I am about this partnership. Today's episode is brought to us by Yosemite National Park. If you know me at all, you know that Yosemite is my absolute favorite place in the whole entire world. I've been all over the world. I've seen almost every national park. Yosemite is special. It just has this aura about it, this just air that is magical and important. You can tell, it's one of the first protected pieces of land ever in the world. It's amazing. It is a window to heaven. And what makes it so great is the hundreds of miles of some of the best hiking trails in the world. Leisurely walks down in the valley. I'm talking like flat walks all the way to the adventurous treks with thousands of feet of elevation gain that have the most breathtaking scenes you could ever imagine. Iconic sites like Half Dome, El Capitan, the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias. It will leave you awestruck. And with the fall coming, that means warm days and cool nights. There's also outside of the park the historic gold rush town of Mariposa. Boasts one of the best small town culture scenes in the U.S. Nearby Coulterville, named the friendliest town in America by Reader's Digest. And all throughout Mariposa County, you'll find a variety of options for lodging and recreation, rustic cabins to four-diamond resorts, and everything in between. Great dining options, museums galore, including the Yosemite Climbing Museum, which we've had people on this show from there, and even live music festivals. And if you're like me, you're into history and the history of the national parks, well, that's where it all got started. There is no place on earth like Yosemite. And in fact, beyond this partnership, I hope one day that we can take listeners of this show to Yosemite every year for a yearly retreat. So if you haven't already, plan your trip to Yosemite, plan your trip to Mariposa County, and go be mesmerized and awestruck just like I am every time I go. That is plenty of that for now. Let's get back into the episode. Yeah, in West Virginia. Yeah, it's some of the most impoverished areas of our country for sure. Wow. I'm sure that would shape you. Can you tell me a little bit about, they are at the cutting edge of this new sport, kind of creating the culture. Were he and his friends and the people there aware of just how impactful this was becoming, or did they have any sort of inkling of how big this would be? Or were they just doing what they loved at the time and just kind of, if it drew attention, it drew attention. It didn't matter. Or did you start to see like an awareness with, oh my gosh, I'm influential?
Yeah, I think it grew. It's a great question. Royal always wanted credit for what he did. He never wanted more credit than he deserved, but he always wanted to have, if there were going to be route reports and he did stuff, he wanted his routes to be in there and for the reports to reflect the difficulty to such a degree that, some people thought he was sort of a bit egoistical about it. So within his small cadre, he wanted people to understand, like in the late 50s, early 60s, he wanted people to know what he was doing. He wanted people in the California scene to know he was climbing these hard new routes and that they were being done better than they had been done before. But he didn't have, they didn't really have much sense that they were getting much attention from people. Like, in fact, the American Alpine Club was sort of ignoring them. He went to the Tetons, the Tetons were kind of in Wyoming, were more of a scene than Yosemite, right? So you had to kind of go there and prove yourself as a climber. on these climbs that were not as good really as the ones that he was doing as rock climbs in Yosemite. But obviously, yeah, mid 60s when people started, he got invited to come to Europe and to teach climbing in Europe, and, to England, and he was on a BBC show about rock climbing, and he had a sense then he was building a sport, and, Chouinard as well, and a couple of these other guys, Doug Tompkins, you mentioned. But that from there, that they were all going to like have jobs and be really famous for it. I think Royal, it was probably the late 70s before Royal really thought that was a done deal, right? Like, also the crowd, as happens in climbing, the next crews that come in after you, their whole thing is they're focused on doing better than you in a different way than you. And so there was
more disruptive, more, I don't know, counterculture or
yes,
whatever.
exactly.
And really, you're just the younger version of the folks. It's just a cycle. It's an endless cycle.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the essence and kind of the goals of dirtbagging really hasn't changed in the last, 80 years or so, which is work wherever you can to earn enough money to climb as much as possible.
Yeah, and they were serious. I mean, like hanging around Yosemite, just climbing, smoking dope, spending as little money as possible. That was Yosemite in 1962, right? Like, and Yvon Chouinard was like, he didn't own a tent, and he would spend months in the summer in the Canadian Rockies. And these guys, they really lived to climb in a time when there was no prospect of getting anything out of it for yourself, like right through the 60s, maybe late 60s. It was getting more popular and became kind of part of the outdoor education movement and so on. But
well, let me ask you this about that, because that's a great, the last few questions here. Did he feel pressure to get his, quote, life together during that time? Because you're right, there isn't even the possibility of a career at that point. Even now you could lean on, well, I could become a YouTuber or an influencer or something. You can lean on personality. But at that time, there wasn't a whole lot. What kind of pressures was he getting around him? And then how did that change once he became a father?
Well, it absolutely, he felt a lot of pressure to succeed. It was a great time of success for Americans, like people were
Post-World War.
Post-World War, economic boom, America was like this total powerhouse as an economy, California especially, and people were succeeding. And his wife's family, the Berkners, were very successful, right? They had his father-in-law had a highly successful paint business, and he was very patient with Royal, and Royal worked selling paint a lot. But Royal in his
like house paint,
yeah. But
I come from a family of painters myself.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a big business, right? Modesto and all these suburbs are going up all over the place, and
we call ourselves artists, but we just say it's just one color. But
artists in one color, that's right. And Liz was like, Royal, we have to get it together. We can't like live out of a van for the rest of our lives. And then he felt that pressure, and then he started this business out of the back of his father-in-law's paint shop, and he turned out to be really good at running the business. Yeah, so he definitely felt, these people, they spent some 7, 8, 10 years of their lives just in Yosemite, or a few times a year, a month, 2 months, maybe doing some job in San Francisco or somewhere else, going back to Yosemite. And eventually I think mostly they got to the point where it's like they'd achieved what they were going to achieve. The new young climbers were in town and, gunning to outdo them. And they found other stuff to do. And Royal definitely, he kept his love of Yosemite, he kept going to Yosemite and caring about it, but he also built this business and his family. Right?
This will be my last question after, or other than asking where to find the book. But what do you think Royal would think about modern climbing? I know he was alive and with us up until 2017, so he got to see basically modern day climbing. But what were his views as climbing progressed, and where do you think they would be now in 2023?
Well, his views evolved over time. I think that he was one of the people who was very concerned there'd be sport climbing in Yosemite, like there'd be lots of bolts, and there never was because nobody really wanted that. I mean, there was a small number of sport climbs, there still are, but I mean, it never really amounted to anything a substantial threat. He had a time when he was very afraid of that, and he was sort of agitating against, sport climbing happening, but he gave up on that when he saw that that wasn't really going to be the case. He went to climbing gyms when he was older. He was old, he lived to do that a bit. I think some of the shifts in how climbing adds up. Royal was a very intelligent person, and he would have looked at somebody like Alex Honnold, who is a very good, very keen sport climber who wouldn't have gotten into climbing if it wasn't for climbing gyms. Taking that modern urban exposure into as far as he can in the wild and gone, well, that's pretty awesome. Royal would have been pretty excited to see Alex free solo El Capitan, I think.
Missed it by a couple years.
Yeah. So, I think he would have been balanced in his appraisal, but he certainly would have gravitated towards people who, the kids who come up through the gym and take those strengths and skills and apply them outdoors, which I know for certain is always going to be a small minority of those kids, but
it happens. We've had Alex Honnold's mom on the show to talk about that story. How did Alex get into it? I was just talking to her this morning, so she's a friend of the show, and she's been a guest a few times. But yeah, it did start 5 years old in the gym. She said, I went to go just get some prices, get some information. I turned around and he's halfway up a wall, free soloing, and it's just like never could slow it down after that. So.
Yeah, and like when you look at a group of kids bouldering in the gym, they bring all kinds of styles and sensibilities and commitments to climbing that just didn't exist. They had those things never came into contact with us in climbing, and now they do. And the kids that have that classic mind, which is a minority for rock climbing from that group, we're just seeing what they're doing now, and it's incredible.
I lied. I have one more question. What do you hope will be something people take away from reading this book? Maybe a theme or a word or a story. What do you want people to take away? That
Royal Robbins is a giant in American culture, outdoor culture, but as important in his field important to his field as Hemingway was to literature. One of the great Americans, and that one of the great Americans was the American who invented American rock climbing.
I imagine, going to mountaineersbooks.com or .org, I'm sorry, would be the best place to get this. Comes out September 1st. This will be out after that. And go to mountaineersbooks.org to find Royal Robbins, The American Climber by David Smart. David, thank you so much for being on the show. This was
Thanks so much.
Super interesting. We didn't get to dive into too many stories, but I wanted to save them. I wanted to save because it's beautifully written, and I'm really enjoying going through it. And I want people to read some of these absolutely insane situations he finds himself in. First of all, thank you so much for listening. It means the world to us that you choose to listen to the show. If you'd like to help us further, you can leave a review on iTunes, share us with your friends, your family. It goes a long way to grow in the show. You can also support us financially through patreon.com/adventuresportspodcast. Link is in the show notes. And also, if you have an idea of who could be a good guest for the show, we're always looking for people to tell their story about the outdoors or adventure. So if you know someone, please reach out. Email us at info@adventuresportspodcast.com. And until then, get out there and have some fun.